Snow had fallen all night, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the storm itself. Reed Callahan stood at the edge of his clearing, the axe frozen mid-swing in his hands. The cabin he had built with his own shoulders leaned against the slope like an old soldier, square and battered, but still holding. Smoke curled thin from the stovepipe, fragile against the gray. The world had narrowed to white drifts, bare spruce, and the rhythmic thud of his blades striking wood. That was all he wanted. Order, repetition, no voices but his own. The nearest town sat 12 miles down through rock and ice. The nearest neighbor had died in spring. Out here, the only arguments came from goats or weather, and Reed had made his peace with both. He was 32 years old, broad across the back from years of carrying loads the army hadn't paid him enough to carry, and his eyes carried more language than his tongue ever would. English, Spanish, Apache, he had spoken them all once, a bridge between men who swore they wanted peace, until he learned that peace was just another word that broke as easy as glass. He remembered women crying out when soldiers raided villages. They called suspicious, remembered children dragged into wagons, old men left half buried in the dust. Reed had spoken then, begged for restraint, offered words instead of bullets. No one listened. When he finally walked away, it wasn't desertion, it was survival. 6 winters had passed since he put down the uniform and raised a cabin wall by wall. Since then, silence had suited him better than prayer. But silence did not always mean safety. That morning, as the sun rose dull and pale, Reed felt the hairs at the back of his neck stir. He leaned his weight on the axe handle and listened. The snow carried no wind, no bird call. Yet beneath it, a rhythm, soft but steady, steps, human. Not the crunch of a lone trapper or a drunk lost from the pass. More than one. Light, cautious. He set the axe down slow, fingers brushing the butt of the revolver on his belt. He did not draw yet. The sound came clearer, up from the pines that pressed against the clearing. Then they emerged. 5 figures. Women, walking slow across the white crust. Their feet were red from cold, wrapped in rags where boots should have been. Their dresses were torn thin, patched so many times the fabric barely held together. Frost encrusted their shoulders where blankets hung crooked. They had no wagon, no horses, only the weight of exhaustion holding them upright. Reed did not move. The one in front carried herself with a kind of stubborn pride. Her frame was curved, her dark hair tied back with a strip of sinew, and though her lips were cracked and her face pale, her eyes stayed sharp. She stepped forward and spoke before the others could. "One night," she said, voice dry but steady. "We need a place. Only that." Reed's jaw tightened. He had seen what she did not say, the youngest woman limping, blood down her thigh, the tallest holding her arm like it had been wrenched from the socket, another clutching a satchel that could not have held more than scraps. They were not drifters. They were survivors. Apache. Widows, if he read their bearing right. He thought of the last time he had opened his door, 3 years ago, to a trapper who drank his stores, stole his mare, and left him tied in his own barn for a day and a half. That lesson had scarred deeper than any bullet. Trust cost too much on the frontier. Yet the women before him were not men chasing debt. They were worn thin, but not broken. Proud, half-wild, standing tall in the snow like wind-bent pines. Reed's hand dropped from the revolver. He pushed the gate open without a word. One by one they passed him. Each pair of eyes met his, measuring, cautious, alert. The scent of pine needles and blood clung to their clothes. The older one, broad-hipped with deep lines on her face, gave a short nod, but no thanks. He did not ask for one. Inside, the fire had burned low. Reed added a split log, moved the kettle over the flames, and fetched tin bowls from the shelf. He ladled what stew he had, last night's goat meat thick with root vegetables, and passed the bowls around. The women sat near the hearth, eating quietly. No chatter, no pleading. The leader, the one who had spoken, stayed nearest the flames, her torn dress gaping across the chest where it had once been stitched and torn again. She did not try to hide it. Reed felt a hard knot twist in his throat. Not desire, not shame. Anger, cold, clean anger at whatever had done this to her. He looked away. The youngest drank with wide eyes, trembling but silent. The tall one, arms still stiff, stayed nearest the door like a sentry. Another cleaned her bowl with a scrap of cloth before passing it back, as if wasting nothing was the only language she trusted. They had not come for charity. They had come because the snow had left them nowhere else to walk. When supper ended, Reed pulled wool blankets from the chest. He unrolled 2 spare bedrolls beside the stove and set them down without explanation. The women spread themselves across the floor, bodies curling in exhaustion. The leader's eyes lingered on him a moment, scanning his belt, his face, the rifle propped near the window. She measured him the way he had measured them. Then she lowered herself onto the bedroll. Reed took his place at the window, rifle across his lap. He kept watch while their breaths softened into sleep. The fire cracked. The snow shifted against the cabin walls. Outside, the land stayed silent. Inside, for the first time in 6 winters, Reed was not alone. He did not sleep. But he did not send them out into the dark either. Morning came with silence too heavy to trust. Reed stirred in the chair by the window, boots still on, rifle across his lap. His neck ached from the night's vigil, but he did not stretch. He listened first. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned to coals, the air thick with the smell of boiled coffee and wood smoke. 5 women still lay where they had dropped, blankets curled, breath even. The youngest, a girl not much past 17, slept with her knees pulled tight to her chest. The tall one, hawk-eyed and unbending, had taken her place nearest the door, arm crooked, as if ready to strike even in sleep. Reed rose quiet and fed the coals until flame licked the kettle again. He had learned not to wake guests too soon. Not goats, not soldiers, not men running from their past. But these weren't guests. They were survivors. He wasn't sure what that made him. The leader stirred first. She pushed herself upright with one elbow, hair loose around her face, eyes already measuring. Reed met her gaze and gave a short nod. No words yet. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. She accepted it without thanks, steadying the cup with both hands, her shoulders squared, though her dress hung torn across the seam. By the time the others roused, the scent of coffee had filled the cabin. Reed divided the last of the goat stew into bowls. No one complained at the sameness of the meal. They ate quick, quiet, every scrape of the spoon against tin, a reminder of hunger carried too long. After breakfast, the leader rose. She crossed the threshold without asking and stepped into the brittle morning. The others followed. Reed stayed behind, watching through the window, but he did not tell them to stop. They moved with purpose. The tall one circled the cabin, scanning the ridge, like a sentry on patrol. Another crouched near the porch rail, studying a blanket, then pulled out a needle and thread to mend it. One dragged a bucket toward the well, arms straining but determined. The youngest, her foot still bandaged in rags, only stood for a while, breathing the cold air, her thin shoulders rising and falling. Not one of them acted like a guest. They acted like people who had survived worse than winter. Reed set his jaw, pulled on his gloves, and stepped outside. The leader was stacking kindling near the shed, her movements slow but stubborn. Reed took up his axe again and split wood. She glanced at him once, then picked up a handful of branches and laid them beside his pile. She did not ask permission. She simply worked. Snow dusted her hair, dampened the torn hem of her dress. The rip along her side seam stretched wider with each bend. Reed's eyes caught the bare skin it revealed, then flicked away. She never once looked to see if he noticed. Midday came, pale sun warming nothing but the roofline. Reed brought out what little remained in his stores, flour, salt, a slab of dried pork. He laid it on the table without a word. Two of the women took to it with practiced hands. One kneaded dough, the other cleared space, their rhythm silent but certain. They had done this before, 1,000 times, with whatever scraps had kept them alive. Reed sat back against the wall, arms crossed, watching. Questions pressed at him. Who were they? Where had they come from? Why risk the mountains in winter? But questions broke trust as quickly as guns. So he held his tongue. Late that afternoon, the leader paused in the doorway while the others worked. Her eyes stayed on him, as if she'd weighed the cost of silence long enough. "We came from below Fort Garland," she said at last. Her voice carried no plea, only fact. "There was a raid, ranchers, drunk, said we were hiding warriors." Reed looked at her, at the bruise near her temple, the red scrape along her neck. He said nothing. "We weren't," she added. Still he kept his silence. "Most of us lost our men months ago." She let the words fall flat. "Widows, all. But they don't care. Widow or not, they take." Reed nodded once, a soldier's nod. No sympathy on his face, but understanding in his eyes. "They burned what little we had. We walked 5 days, no shoes." She glanced toward the youngest, who sat by the fire tying a strip of cloth around her foot, blood already staining through. "We saw your smoke, knew a man lived here alone. We wouldn't have risked it otherwise." Reed's reply was short, his voice rough with restraint. "You guessed right." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, then faded. "We won't stay long. Just long enough to walk again." He did not answer. He fetched a second axe from the shed and laid it against the woodpile. By dusk, one woman had patched the back gate. Another had fixed the latch on the door. The sound of hammering and stitching joined the winter air until it seemed the cabin had always been theirs. That night, all 5 slept indoors, blankets closer to the stove. Reed took his chair again, rifle laid across his lap. The leader stretched, on her side facing him, her eyes open longer than the others. She said nothing. Neither did he. But when her breath slowed into sleep, Reed knew something had shifted. He was no longer keeping them out. He was keeping them in. The wind that morning cut sharp enough to feel like teeth. Reed stepped onto the porch, his boots sinking into snow hardened by the night frost. The ridge above the cabin carried no prints, no smoke. Still he scanned it twice, rifle resting, in the crook of his arm. Winter had a way of swallowing sound, but it never swallowed threat. Behind him, the cabin stirred alive. He heard the scrape of a broom across the floorboards, the low murmur of women speaking in their tongue, not hurried, not loud, but steady. Survivors did not chatter. They worked. The leader stepped out a moment later, pulling her blanket tighter across her shoulders. Her eyes followed his up the ridge, the same way they had last night when she lay awake across from him. She didn't ask what he saw. She only watched. "You get visits from town?" she asked finally. Reed shook his head. "No. Someone bring you goods? I ride down once a month, not until thaw." She nodded once, absorbing the truth. No one would be checking on them until spring. Whatever happened in this cabin, it would remain buried under snow. She let the door close behind her and went to the woodpile. By mid-morning, work had divided itself. The tall one circled the goat pen, fixing the slats with a strip of rawhide. The smallest one dragged water from the well, arms trembling but stubborn. The one with a stiff arm kept near the hearth, mending what little cloth they had. Even the youngest, pale from fever and wound, folded blankets with the care of someone who understood survival, rested in order. Reed split wood until sweat dampened his collar despite the cold. When he paused, the leader was already beside him, stacking kindling with a limp rhythm. Her face shone with effort, but she did not falter. "You're not from White Mountain," Reed said at last, his voice more observation than question. She paused, the axe balanced in her hand. "Near Fort Apache," she answered. Her accent made sense now, neither noble-born nor farmer's wife. Somewhere in between, hardened by miles. Reed nodded. "Army sent me there once. Translation." She looked at him long enough to measure his truth. "And you left." "I left." She asked no more. That was answer enough. At midday he brought rabbit and dried herbs to the table. The women worked quick, boiling water, scraping skins, turning scraps into something more than hunger. Reed sat back again, arms crossed, watching how their hands moved, how the rhythm of survival filled the cabin like a song he hadn't heard in years. Later, as dusk drew down, the leader returned to the doorway. "We were hunted," she said, simply. "Not warriors, not wives anymore either, just widows. That makes us easy." Reed's jaw tightened. He did not say the thing he thought, that out here, easy prey often died fast. Instead, he pulled nails and rope from the chest and laid them on the table. A second axe, spare tools. He offered no explanation. They didn't ask. By dark, one had stitched the curtain that flapped in the draft. Another had patched the back door. The tall one tested every window latch, fingers sharp, eyes sharper. Reed found himself watching the cabin shift from a place of solitude into something else. A shape of belonging, fragile but forming. After supper, he sat near the stove, with his rifle same as before. But this time, when the leader walked past him to her blanket, her hip brushed his knee. Not an accident, not an invitation, just the kind of touch that said, "We know you're here, and we're not afraid anymore." Reed didn't move. He didn't answer. He only kept the fire alive while 5 women breathed easy inside his cabin. For years, silence had been Reed's shield. Tonight, silence felt heavier, not empty, full. The knock at the door came like a rifle crack through the snow. Reed's head lifted at once. His rifle leaned against the wall, close enough for his hand, but not yet drawn. The women froze where they sat, Kay with her needle halfway through. Asim, paw stiff as a blade near the door, Tala clutching her blanket until her knuckles whitened. The leader, Cyan, met Reed's eyes. She didn't move, didn't breathe loud enough to carry. The second knock came, slower, deliberate. Whoever stood outside wasn't begging. Reed crossed the room, boots steady against the boards. He pulled the door wide just enough to see the figure on the porch. Snow swirled around a man in a weather-worn coat, his hat dripping melt. A deputy star gleamed against his vest, dulled by tarnish, but unmistakable. "Afternoon," the man said, voice carrying the kind of casual ease Reed had heard before from soldiers who wanted you off guard. "Name's Harlan, deputy out of Wolf Hollow." Reed's eyes didn't soften. "You're off your road." The deputy shifted his weight, boots creaking in the snow. "Looking for a pair of mules. Stolen 2 nights past. Tracks run this way." His gaze slid past Reed's shoulder, catching the firelight, the shadows of movement inside. "You've got company." Reed didn't step aside. "Neighbors from the ridge," he lied. The deputy smiled thin, the kind of smile that didn't warm anything. "Funny. Ridge has been empty since last spring, unless ghosts mend curtains." Cyan stepped forward then, silent, until her voice cut sharp. "We work here," she said flat. "Food for roof. Nothing more." The deputy's eyes flicked to her, lingered too long on the rip in her dress, then back to Reed. "Hired help, is it?" Reed's jaw stayed tight. "That's right." The silence that followed stretched long enough for the fire to snap behind them. Then Harlan shrugged, turning his collar up against the cold. "If you see them mules, you send word." He stepped off the porch, boots crunching into snow. His tracks cut across the yard, swallowed quick by wind. Reed didn't close the door. until the figure disappeared into the pines. Only then did he turn back. The youngest, Tala, trembled, her eyes red as if she'd been on the edge of crying. Pa stood like iron beside her, hand on the girl's shoulder, steadying her. He saw, Sion said low. Reed nodded once. He won't ride back alone next time. That evening, the cabin carried a different weight. The women worked quieter, sharper, every sound purposeful. Pa sat awake, sharpening a knife. Ka mended a seam, as if each stitch tied them tighter to survival. Nolly cleaned the shelves with a rag until the wood shone. Reed sat by the door, rifle laid across his lap. He had not invited this war, but it had found his clearing anyway. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking of how to weather it alone. After the others lay down, Sion stayed near the window, eyes on the ridge. When Reed rose to check the latches, she spoke without turning. "We should go." "No," Reed said. She faced him then, her jaw set. "That deputy brings men. It won't matter if we're widows or ghosts. They'll drag us out." "If he meant to drag you," Reed said evenly, "he wouldn't have come alone." Sion folded her arms, firelight cutting across the bruise near her temple. "You think we're safe here?" "I think you're safer than out there." Her silence stretched long. The fire hissed. Finally she nodded once, though her eyes still burned with calculation. "Then we stand." Reed didn't answer, but, as he laid another log on the fire, he knew it for truth. Outside, the snow had stopped. The ridge lay still, but the silence wasn't safety anymore. It was warning. The storm broke on the third night, but what it left behind was heavier than snow. Wind had piled drifts high against the cabin walls, sealing the clearing in white silence. Inside, the fire hissed low, shadows thrown across faces that no longer looked like strangers. They moved around one another in rhythm now, Kay mending Reed's coat with tight, careful stitches, Nolly grinding herbs she'd salvaged into powder, Pa keeping her post by the door, knife never far. Tala, the youngest, rested her bandaged foot, her eyes following every movement as if memorizing what safety looked like. Reed brought down his old army chest from the loft. Its leather corners were cracked, its lock rusted. He hadn't opened it in years. When he set it on the table, the women looked up. Inside lay scraps of his past, folded papers stamped with county ink, worn maps, the faded translation manuals the army had once pressed into his hands. He laid them out slow, not for show, but for survival. "If lawmen come back," Reed said, his voice steady, "they'll want answers. These give them enough to leave." Sion stepped closer, her dark eyes flicking across the pages. Her jaw tightened at the words written there. Property lines, employment contracts, military discharge papers. She touched one with her fingers, rough from work, but gentle on the ink. "You kept these." "They keep me standing," Reed said. "They'll keep us too?" He met her gaze. "If you let them." The others leaned in, their faces caught by firelight. Pa's eyes narrowed, distrust still sharp but not closed. Nolly traced the edge of a map with her fingertip, silent but intent. Ka studied the lines like she might sew them back together if she could. Tala only glanced once, then lowered her eyes. Sion stayed standing, her shoulders drawn, her breath slow. "We walked because we had nothing left. No men, no tribes willing to claim us without them, no names anyone cared to remember." She straightened, looking Reed full in the face. "You give us papers, you give us a place. That makes us a household." Reed nodded. "It makes you more than prey." For a moment, the fire cracked, and nothing else broke the silence. Then Nolly laughed, quiet and sharp, almost a release. Ka smiled, faint. Even Pa's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a grin but wasn't cold either. Sion did not laugh. Instead, she leaned her hands on the table. Close enough her fingers brushed the blade Reed had been sharpening. "Why?" she asked, voice low. "Why risk it?" Reed stared at her. Because I let you in. Her eyes softened for the first time. Not weak, just less guarded. That night, after the others lay down, Sayan lingered by the fire. She poured herself a cup of water, then held it, not drinking, just standing in the doorway between firelight and shadow. Reed sat with his rifle across his knees, his gaze steady. You're not like the others, she said. Reed's brow furrowed. Others? Men. Quiet men still expect payment. Patient men still take what they want. You? She hesitated, then let the words out. You haven't asked for anything. Reed's throat tightened. He met her eyes, rough and unflinching. I'm not them. Her face softened further, lines of exhaustion giving way to something older, deeper. That's the problem, she whispered. She set the tin aside and stepped closer. The space between them thinned, filled with the heat of fire and breath. Her hand rose just slightly, fingers brushing against his chest, cold fingertips against steady heartbeat. Reed didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't grab. He simply held her gaze. She leaned up and kissed him. Not rushed, not shy. A kiss that tasted of smoke and salt, patient and searching. When she pulled back, she said nothing more. She lay down across the room, her back turned to him, her breathing evening out. Reed sat there long after, staring at the fire. His hand rose to his chest where her fingers had rested. For years, silence had been all he trusted. Now silence carried something else. Promise. The tracks appeared before dawn, carved deep into snow no one from the cabin had walked. Reed crouched low at the edge of the clearing, his gloved hand brushing over the impressions. Boot prints. Fresh. They had circled wide through the trees, then cut back downhill. Whoever made them had not come close, not bold enough to knock again, but bold enough to watch. When he returned to the cabin, his jaw was tight, his rifle already loaded. Sayan caught his face before he spoke, her eyes sharp. She didn't ask. She already knew. They're watching, Reed said finally. The women froze where they worked. Ka's thread stilled mid-seam. Nolly's hand paused on the broom handle. Pa's gaze hardened, knife sliding closer across the table. Tala shrank back against the stove, her small frame folding inward. We're not hidden anymore, Sayan said. Not from the start, Reed replied. That day, the cabin shifted into something harder. Pa blocked the chimney flue halfway, just in case someone tried smoke. Ka stitched extra layers into the blankets. Nolly reinforced the roof seam with scrap leather. Even Tala, limping but stubborn, carried kindling from the shed, her face set in concentration. Reed worked alongside them, splitting wood, hammering nails into the fence, sharpening the old hunting knife he hadn't touched in years. His mind stayed fixed on the ridge, on the possibility of riders cresting it with questions not meant for answering. By dusk, the air in the cabin felt stretched tight, heavy with waiting. Reed kept to the door, his rifle resting across his knees. Pa stayed. Up with him, silent, a sentinel in her own right, Sayan lingered near the window. She didn't sit. She didn't speak. At last she crossed the room and leaned against the post beside him. We should leave, she said. No, Reed answered without turning. She studied his profile, the scar near his left eye, the way his shoulders never seemed to rest. He'll bring more men, more questions. If he meant to, Reed said, he wouldn't have come alone the first time. Her eyes narrowed. You think you can hold this place against all of them? Reed turned now, his gaze steady. I think we hold it together or not at all, for a long time she stared at him. The firelight cut sharp across her cheekbones, across the bruise near her temple that had faded, but not vanished. Then her expression shifted, not soft, but certain. Then we stand, she said again. That night, Reed walked the perimeter twice. Each time he saw nothing but white drifts and brittle spruce. But the unease stayed. He returned to find Sayan, Awake by the fire, her back straight, her eyes waiting. She poured him coffee without asking. When he sat, she didn't speak for a long while. The only sound was the hiss of wood and the scrape of Pa's knife against the whetstone. Finally, Sayan leaned forward. Her voice was low, roughened by smoke and memory. When they raided, they said they wanted 2 men who'd stolen horses near Canyon Hollow. They didn't find them, so they took everything else. Reed's hand stilled on his cup. They beat Pa first, Sayan went on, said she mouthed off. Then they tore Nolly's bag from her hands, took our food, burned our shelter, left us with nothing. She drew a breath sharp enough to cut. Didn't kill us. Said we were lucky we weren't with a tribe. Lucky. The word twisted bitter in her mouth. Reed looked at her, the fire throwing lines across her torn dress, across the scars that told their own story. Widows don't get claimed, she said. Not by law, not by tribe. Without men, we're nothing. That's why they walk over us. His reply came low, steady. Not here. Her eyes flicked up, holding his. Why not? Reed didn't flinch. Because I let you in. The words hung heavy between them. Not promise, not vow. Truth, Sayan's. Gaze lingered long enough to read him. Then she nodded once, slow. Her hand brushed the edge of his arm as she rose. Not accident, not invitation. She crossed to her blanket and lay down, her back turned but her breath steady. Reed sat by the fire, the coffee cooling in his hand. Outside, the night carried its silence too clean, too complete. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and for the first time in 6 years, Reed was not afraid of being hunted. He was afraid of losing what he had just begun to protect. The rider came at noon, but the weight he carried was heavier than 1 man on a horse. Reed saw him crest the ridge before the sound reached the cabin. A single figure slouched in the saddle, snow breaking beneath hooves. No wagon, no pack. Mule, no company. Yet Reed knew a lone rider never meant solitude. It meant message. He stepped onto the porch, rifle resting in plain sight across his arm. Behind him, the door creaked. Pa's face appeared, stern, eyes sharp as a hawk's. Sayan's hand rested against the doorframe just out of view, her body still but ready. The rider slowed as he neared the fence. His coat was dusted white, his badge catching a dull glint of sun. The deputy from Wolf Hollow, Harlan. He tipped his hat as though walking into a church. Afternoon again, Callahan. Reed didn't blink. You've come far for mules. The deputy smiled thin. Wasn't mules I saw last time? Was 5 women. Apache widows, if my eyes don't lie. He leaned in the saddle, chewing at the corner of his lip. Funny thing about law, doesn't much care if they're widows or wives. Papers say they don't belong here. Reed's voice was gravel. Papers say they're hired hands, household, legal. Harlan laughed, short and sharp. Filed quick, didn't you? Almost like a man trying to cover tracks before snow melts. His gaze slid past Reed to the cabin door. What's a quiet fellow like you want with 5 women under his roof? The silence that followed was heavy, thick as storm clouds. Reed shifted the rifle higher against his arm. Work for bread, roof for labor, nothing more. The deputy's smile thinned. Town won't see it that way. They won't need to, Reed said flat. For a long moment, nothing but the wind moved. Then the deputy leaned back, reins tugging. Spring's coming. You can hide a lot under. Snow, Callahan, but when it melts, truth leaks through. He turned the horse, boots creaking in the stirrup. You've been warned. The hoofbeats faded into the ridge. Only then did Reed let out the breath that had sat tight in his chest. He turned to find Sayan in the doorway, her jaw clenched, her eyes burning not with fear, but with fury. He'll be back, she said. I know. With others. I know. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her voice stayed hard. You could have turned us out. Saved yourself. Reed's stare was steady. I already made my choice. That night, no one slept. Reed paced the room, checking the latches, sharpening the knife, laying extra wood inside. Pa stayed awake near the door, blade resting in her lap. Sayan sat by the window, her eyes scanning the ridge as if she could burn holes through snow. The others moved quiet, preparing without command. Ka sewing strips of cloth into makeshift bandages, Nolly boiling water, Tala binding her foot tighter. When the fire sank low, Reed dropped into the chair. His hands covered his face, breath slow, heavy not with fear but with weight. He had spent years carving silence for himself, and now, in one winter, he had inherited 5 lives. Sayan crossed the room and knelt beside him. She laid her hand on his thigh, grounding him. Her voice was low, steady. You didn't ask for this. No, Reed admitted. But you didn't run from it either. He lifted his eyes to her, seeing not just the bruise near her temple or the torn seam of her dress, but the iron that held her upright. She leaned closer, her forehead resting against his. If they come, she whispered. We stand, Reed's. Hand rose slow, cupping the back of her neck. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The fire cracked once, sparks spitting into the dark. Outside, the night lay heavy. And for the first time, Reed wasn't a man defending silence. He was a man defending family. The snow melted slow, but what remained was harder than stone. It was choice. By the second week of thaw, the valley shifted. Ice dripped steady from the roof. The creek gurgled awake beneath its crust, and the ridges no longer carried silence. They carried birdsong. The storm had passed, but the danger had not. Every day Reed walked the tree line at dawn and again before dark. No fresh prints, no deputy. But the memory of his visit hung like smoke in the rafters. Inside them, cabin life had rooted deeper. Ka baked with what flour remained, proud when Reed muttered it reminded him of his mother's bread. Nolly carved symbols into the walls, small marks of memory no one asked her to explain. Pa built a bench on the porch, her knife stroke steady, her eyes still sharp. Tala limped less each day, her laughter timid but real, and Sayan stayed close. To Reed, splitting wood beside him, brushing snow from his shoulders, pouring his coffee without waiting for a word. The torn seam of her dress never mended, but she wore it like armor now, proof of what she had survived. Reed never once looked at her with pity, only with the kind of steadiness that made her shoulders ease. One evening, with light stretching, long across the ridge, Reed brought out the ledger from his chest. At the table, with all 5 women watching, he wrote their names one by one. Sayan, Pa, Ka, Nolly, Tala. He stamped them as household, kin, under his protection. He did not ask permission. He simply did it, then pushed the papers across the table. Pa read hers first. She nodded once, then passed it on. Ka touched her page with reverence, eyes wet but unbroken. Nolly smiled faint, her fingers tracing the ink. Tala held hers in both hands, like something too fragile to fold. Sayan read last. When she lifted her eyes to Reed, she said nothing. She simply crossed the room and kissed him in front of them all. No one laughed, no one questioned. The choice had been made. 2 days later, under the spruce tree behind the cabin, they married. No preacher, no clerk, no crowd, just them. The women stood close, the wind cutting through branches like witnesses. Reed spoke one sentence. You, stay with me and I'll stay with you, Sayan answered. Then we stay. That was enough. Pa crossed her arms but smiled. Ka slipped a braid of woven hair into Sayan's hand. An Apache tradition carried forward. Nolly carved a small circle into the spruce trunk, marking permanence. Tala placed wildflowers at their feet, her smile shy but proud. Reed kissed Sayan beneath the tree, not rushed, not hidden. and for the first time since he built the cabin, he no longer felt like he lived alone. He felt like he lived. Weeks passed. The thaw deepened, earth showing green. Word drifted through the valley. Callahan's place was full now, 5 Apache, widows under his roof. Some called it scandal. Some called it folly. But when the town clerk rode up for inspection, the papers were in order, the cabin in good repair, and the women smiling at the man who had given them names that law could not erase. No law was broken. No one could touch them. One evening, as dusk folded over the valley, Reed sat on the porch with Cyan in his lap, her back warm against his chest. The others laughed inside, Noli humming a low tune, Ka fussing over the bread. Tala speaking a few brave words that made Pa chuckle. Cyan's hand rested against her stomach. Reed noticed, his brow tightening. She turned her head, her voice low. In a few months, he held her tighter. You scared? Her eyes glimmered in the last light. Not anymore. Reed looked out across the ridge where the corn had just begun to sprout. They won't understand it, he murmured. Cyan smiled, soft but unyielding. They don't have to. The fire inside flared. The cabin once meant for one man now carried 6 souls, bound not by law, not by tribe, but by choice. A choice, forged in winter, tested by silence, and sealed by love. And that is how one forgotten winter in 1882 turned a cabin into a family, and a quiet man into something more than himself. History books don't write about widows without tribes or soldiers who walked away from war. But sometimes the truest history lives in places like this, in a cabin that should have been silent, and in hearts that chose to stand together. If this story spoke to you, ride with us again. Like the video, share it with someone who loves the Wild West, and subscribe to Shadow Frontier Tales, where every tale is carved out of hardship, hope, and history that almost slipped away.